So it's a pleasure to talk again with the Western New York group about my observations and thoughts on thinning. I hope none of you in Western New York listened to the previous presentation because some of it's a repeat. But I'll start with just this model of precision thinning that we've used now for a number of years, showing that we really try to accomplish thinning in several steps. I hope many of you put some blossom thinning sprays on using the pollen tube growth model. But regardless of whether that was accomplished or not, it's now one of the most critical times of the year for thinning with the Petal Fall spray. At Petal Fall is when we first begin to use the carbon balance model. It is very good to help us understand the expected outcome of the thinning sprays. And so I would encourage each person to run the model at their location on the exact day they're going to spray to get the latest and best predictions. I also want to emphasize that regardless of how well we do at predicting the response, actually seeing the response by measuring fruitlet diameters and using the fruit growth rate model is a tremendous help to then deciding what to do at this normal 10 to 12 millimeter timing that will come up next week. For 2022, my observation and assessment of the year is as follows. Green tip was later this year than the previous 3 years. Previously, we often were in the last week of March. This year, it didn't really occur until April 10th. For the inland sites and closer to April 16th for the lake sites. Following green tip, we had relatively cool temperatures that moved us slowly from green tip to first bloom. But at first bloom, we ran into these really warm temperatures that moved us quickly from first bloom all the way through bloom and rapidly to petal fall. From what I've seen, bloom in most blocks was pretty good. The extension staff, Mario and Craig, have given me that they have assessed full bloom when 80 to 90% of all the flowers were open somewhere between May 11th for some inland sites and as late as May 15th for lake sites. Now, I haven't picked up very much winter damage in Western New York at all, although there are a few clusters that have poorly formed flowers and maybe some kings that were damaged, but in general, there's almost no winter damage. Because of the warm weather during bloom, we had good bee activity, and we really had no frost to complicate the thinning situation this year. So now that we're at petal fall or close to it, let's assess what we want to do in terms of thinning. I'm going to show you the results of the carbon balance model for 2 locations. For lake sites, I picked Williamson in Wayne County. And for inland sites, I picked Medina over in Orleans County. Let's first start with what it looks like in Williamson. This was the results of the model that I ran this morning. And I want to point out several columns of data. The first arrow points to this column of carbohydrate status using a weighted average of 7 days. It shows that where the bloom was on May 14th, we had a series of days with negative 7-day average. And they're really not hugely negative, but a reasonable amount of deficit, which is useful when we want to thin. And so if you look in the last column with the last arrow, the recommendation was that we should put on full rates or even increase rates if we thinned with hormone type thinners during the bloom period. But as you see from the little green circle, the expected thinning efficacy was relatively low. There's low risk of over thinning. I also want to point out this column of degree days. And you can see that from bloom, which we put as May 14th for this lake site, we've accumulated some degree days, but in a relatively slow fashion, because although we had heat on the 12th, 13th, and 14th, and some good temperatures on the 15th. Since then, we've had this series of relatively cool days. So that on May the 18th that we are today, we would have accumulated around 60-degree days. And to put on a Petal Fall thinning spray, you need to get close to 110-degree days. If you look at graphic form of what happened in Williamson, you see that we've had some ups and downs since green tip in April, but at full bloom on May 14th, we had just gone through the most negative period with a combined 7-day average deficit in the -22 to -24, which is a really nice amount of deficit, but not excessive. When we get to -60 is where we really get concerned about overthinning. But since then, with relatively cool temperatures, the deficits have moderated to somewhere around -10. And as we look at today, the next to the last dot on this chart on the 18th, we're expected to stay the same pretty much tomorrow. But the expected window for thinning for Petal Fall is not for several more days. I estimate that the Petal Fall thinning window for lake sites will start on Sunday, May 22nd, and will go through Tuesday on May 24th. If you look at the temperatures, I don't have that far forecasted, but if you look at May 21st, May 22nd, May 23rd, they're all temperatures that are 70 or below. So relatively cool during the predicted Petal Fall thinning window for lake sites. To me, that's unfortunate because a little bit of warmer weather at Petal Fall does give much better thinning. But we won't be at that stage of flower and fruit development in the lake region, right along the lake, until we get to Sunday and beyond. In contrast, when you look at inland sites, happens to be the data for Medina, bloom was earlier. In this case, I put full bloom on the 11th of May. And you can see that we had a fairly substantial deficit right after and during full bloom. It's moderated a little bit since then, but today on May 18th, the window for thinning, Petal Fall thinning opens and will probably go from today through Sunday or Monday. We look at that with the chart here on the bottom showing that today on May the 18th, we've accumulated 111-degree days. So that's the moment when Petal Fall thinning could commence. And today we're relatively modest temperatures inland at 64 in Medina, then tomorrow 67. And so we could thin today, tomorrow, but May the 20th on Friday looks to be a really nice warm day at Medina, 85 degrees, and Saturday 85, but even warmer at night, 70 at night. And so those 2 days will produce substantial deficits, but on a 7-day average, it still won't be excessive. And so we will still be in that window on May the 20th, Friday, and we could even spray on the 21st on Saturday. So for the Medina area, we're now starting the thinning window, and this meeting is exactly at the right time. The people could begin spraying tomorrow, Thursday, or Friday, or Saturday. Now, a couple of caveats that I want to mention. I think it's still a little early to accurately assess fruit set in Western New York, but for all appearances, what I can see so far, it looks very good. And at Geneva, we're basically on the same timing as Medina, and you can start to see where you've got set. But because we've had relatively good bloom, really good weather during bloom and bee flight, we're expecting a really heavy set. Thus, the Petal Fall spray becomes a really essential component of this year's thinning program. For inland sites, I think you've got just a fabulous window of temperatures in the mid 70s and 80s to thin. For lake sites, which are slightly delayed, it looks like your window will occur during cooler weather and won't be quite as satisfying, and we won't probably get as good a thinning from the lake sites if we delay until Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday. Regardless, every block probably needs something at Petal Fall. The most common would be NAA and 7, but also NAD and 7 works extremely well. But this year, where we have temperatures, at least for the inland sites of 70s and 80s, I think Maxell and 7 is a great option for small fruited varieties that include Gala, Empire, New York 1. It's also a great option for Fuji, where we don't like to use NAA because it produces some pygmy fruit. So this year you could get substantial amount of thinning done on Fuji with a Petal Fall Maxell and 7. The third caveat is that these ranges of degree days that I'm suggesting for Petal Fall thinning or 12 millimeter thinning or 18 millimeter thinning are suggestions. You can spray before that range or even after that range and still get good results. But their ranges are designed so that if you spray a Petal Fall in this window between 110 and 125 or 130 degree days, it gives you about a week to assess the results before you have to decide what you're going to spray at the 12 millimeter timing when you're at the 200 to 250 degree days. And then there's about a week between that timing and when you might have to spray a rescue spray if needed. The options that are available at Petal Fall are numerous, and people that are historically quite conservative sometimes only want to spray carbaryl. Carbaryl with warm temperatures will do a really nice job at breaking clusters down to 2 fruits and maybe singling them down to 1 fruit. But it's relatively mild thinner. And another option is just amide thin. That's a traditional thinner for Petal Fall, works very well, very safe. But the combinations of Maxell or NAA or NAD with 7 are the most common things to spray at Petal Fall. Historically, when we have not really warm temperatures, NAA and 7 is probably the most consistent, but NAD and 7 is probably equally as consistent. But under cool temperatures, Maxell and 7 doesn't give very much thinning at Petal Fall. This year, the inland sites, I think, can take advantage of Maxell and 7 and have really good results. Now, if there are growers who want to not use carbaryl in their spray program for marketing purposes, then we've had very good luck with combining NAA and Maxell instead of NAA and 7 at Petal Fall and gotten really good, almost very similar thinning to NAA and 7. We hope that in 2 years' time, we'll have this new thinner, Metametron, which is very potent at Petal Fall and also 10 millimeters and 18 millimeters. And it will work well whenever there's a deficit. But it's not yet registered for use in New York. I have some suggestions for you this year. I think it's really critical that you run the carbohydrate model. It's really simple to use. It's available 3 different ways on the NUA website, the Cornell hosted NUA website. It's available. It's also available at a different website that we call malusim.org. And you can use your laptop computer to access that site or even your phone. But in addition, the third way is by downloading a mobile phone app called Malusim that's available at both the Apple App Store and the Android App Store. And I would suggest that you download the newest version. We've just released a new version just a few days ago. Go to either the Apple App Store or the Android App Store and download a new version of Malusim, and you can run the carbohydrate model from your phone. I want to remind you that one of the big benefits of the carbohydrate model is to prevent big mistakes. And big mistakes of overthinning happen when we see carbohydrate deficits of -60 or lower on the 7-day average. So if that were to happen, we would say don't spray on those days. Wait for slightly better conditions. It doesn't appear that we will be anywhere close to that during this Petal Fall thinning window. I want to emphasize that at Petal Fall, all thinners are mild thinners. None are very aggressive. Thus, on a positive way to look at that, there's little risk of overthinning, even though we're predicted to have temperatures in the 80s, high 80s over the next several days for the inland sites. People should not be afraid to thin. Those temperatures, although will produce substantial deficits, will be good to help us get good thinning, but will not result in overthinning at this early timing of relatively small fruits at Petal Fall. So the model is indicating that there will be a significant deficit to help people in the more inland sites to achieve good thinning. But unfortunately, when lake sites get to this stage, it will be cooler and we won't have that deficit to help. I wanted to review with you just some suggestions that I have for thinning both Honeycrisp and Gala. I think blossom thinning of Honeycrisp is essential. I hope many of you put on ATS at 2.5 or 3% over the last week. I know it was difficult to get it on at the right time, and we had rain that complicated things, but I hope that there was a lot of ATS that went out. Now that we're approaching the 5 to 6 millimeter stage, certainly on the inland side, our suggestion is NA and 7 on Honeycrisp, 3 ounces of NA and a pint of 7. And I'll explain how that 3 ounces per 100 and a pint of 7 should be thought of when putting and mixing up a tank of spray. That should be followed by another spray of NA and 7 at the 11, 12, or 13 millimeter timing. And if needed, which I hope is not needed this year, at really big fruits of 16, 17, and 18 millimeters, then we switch to a Maxell 7 and oil spray at that timing. I want to add that this year, there is a new chemical thinner that is registered from Valent. It's called Exceed. It's got a registration label for New York, but Valent as a company have decided not to openly sell it this year, to introduce it in a slower way. And so they will work with you, with their representative helping guide you and provide product if you want to try Exceed. I think that if you use it at the large fruit size, it works best combined with Maxell. For Gala, I really like a Maxell-based program from Petal Fall on. However, Bloom and NA or Amethyst spray has been very helpful. I'm just going to skip going over the rates specifically, but I'm going to switch to this slide that has some suggestions that I want to make. It appears to me, based upon the forecast, that the window for thinning in inland sites would be Geneva, Medina, Lyons area in Wayne County, opens today, May 18th, and will go through Saturday, May 21st. However, for lake sites, that will be delayed to Sunday, May 22nd through Tuesday, May 24th. And there's a whole range of sites in between those right on the lake and those 10, 15 miles inland. I suggest that you use full rates this year, even the inland sites that we'll be looking at a couple of days in the 80s. For Honeycrisp and Gala and Snapdragon, 7.5 parts or 3 ounces of NA plus a pint of 7 works great. For Macintosh, a lower rate of NA seems to be the best, only 2 ounces and a pint of 7. For Cortland, I like to not put in the 7, just NA. But this year with warm temperatures, particularly for the inland sites, I think there's an opportunity to use Maxell on Gala with 64 ounces of Maxell plus a pint of 7 to give good thinning. Now, I do want to pause at this point and walk you through how these rates should be interpreted. I remind you that what we write in the recommends book and what I've put here are rates that are based on dilute tree row volume sprays, but almost nobody carries all the water to put on a dilute spray. So to calculate how much chemical you put in the tank when you're not spraying full dilute, we use something called a concentration factor. To calculate a concentration factor, you first calculate the tree row volume for the orchard and then the concentration factor by dividing the tree row volume by the actual volume of spray that you are going to use. And the example I give here is a tall spindle orchard, typically when it's mature at 3 by 12 or 3 by 11, and it's 11 or 12 feet tall, they generally measure a tree row volume of somewhere around 200. But let's suppose that you're only going to spray 100 gallons per acre. So you're putting on half the water, but to get the right chemical on, you've got to have in that water twice as much chemical. So the 200 tree row volume divided by the actual spray 100 gives a concentration factor of 2. Then you use that factor to multiply the rates I've suggested to come up with the actual amount per acre. The example I give here is, let's suppose this is a Honeycrisp block and we're going to spray 3 ounces of NA per 100 dilute, but our concentration factor is 2 like we calculated above. So you'd multiply 3 times 2 to give 6 ounces of NA in every 100 gallons. Now my sprayer, let's suppose it's a 500 gallon sprayer. So I have 5 of these 100 gallon units. So I have to take 6 multiplied by 5. I've got about 30 ounces of NA in the spray tank. And then I'm going to spray 5 acres with that. So each acre is going to get 6 ounces. So this is important to understand and do when you interpret the rates that we suggest in this presentation or in the Cornell recommends. Now, one last caution. Some people like to double the amount of 7 that goes in the tank like they would with NA. I don't like to use the concentration factor for carbaryl or for surfactants. With carbaryl, the reason is that it's only soluble at 1 pint per 100. So if you have a 500 gallon sprayer and you put 5 pints of 7 in that sprayer, that's the maximum amount that's soluble. And only the amount that's soluble when it's sprayed out and lands on the leaf can be absorbed by the leaf. If you put a 2nd pint per 100 of 7 in there, it's not in solution. It's mixed and held in suspension. When it's sprayed out, it lands on the leaf, and those extra 7 granules just dry onto the surface of the leaf, but they're not absorbed by the leaf to cause thinning, which works great because then it acts as an insecticide. But if you get re-wetting, then some of that 7 is redissolved in new rain droplets or dew, and more is taken up, and sometimes you get more thinning than you expect. So I like to have only the amount of 7 that's soluble in the tank, and therefore I don't use the concentration factor to adjust for the amount of 7. I want to comment briefly about what kind of crop load you should target. These are graphs from some studies we did in 2021 in both Washington, New York, Michigan, and North Carolina. And in all cases, particularly in the East, based upon the thinning we got and the economics, showed that we should have crop loads somewhere 8, 9, or 10 on Gala. That's much higher than what we suggested in the past. With Honeycrisp, it was slightly lower, somewhere around 8. But that leads me to these suggested crop loads, which are a little bit higher than what I've suggested in the past. For Gala, in maximizing crop value, a crop load of 8 fruits per square centimeter seems to be the sweet spot. With Honeycrisp, it's a little bit less, only 6 fruits per square centimeter, whereas in the past we've suggested 4 to 5 fruits, but 6 seems to give us the best economic result. With Macintosh and Snapdragon, somewhere in between, let's say 7 fruits per square centimeter. Now, this measure of crop load works on young trees up to about year 8 or 9. But if you have orchards in that area, you can calculate how many apples you should carry based upon measuring the trunk circumference, converting it to cross-sectional area, and multiplying by 8 for Gala or 6 for Honeycrisp. Let me conclude this part with just some tips. I think it's essential that you go out to every block and you assess flower quality. Is the king present? Are there 5 or 6 flowers in every cluster? Do they all look healthy? If the answer is yes, then this timing of petal fall, you should use full rates and follow what the carbohydrate model suggests. And it appears that there's a really wonderful window Thursday, Friday, and Saturday to thin for inland sites that will give good thinning. However, if you detect damage in the cluster with kings missing, I think you still have to spray, but with more modest rates. You can't just not spray, even if we had some damage. I really would suggest you try to time your petal fall spray based on degree days, and that window is now in inland sites up through Saturday, but for lake sites, it will open up Sunday, it appears, and go through Tuesday. We suggest that you nozzle the sprayer differently for each spray. For those of you that use blossom sprays, we suggest a uniform nozzling from the top to the bottom of the nozzle bank. But now at Petal Fall, we'd like to use a more traditional pattern of 1/3 of the spray volume in the bottom half of the tree and 2/3 of the spray volume directed to the top of the tree. If you move forward to the 12 millimeter timing, then we suggest even more to the top. And this is a number of studies that I did before I left on leave, and Pollyanna continued showing that we got the most uniform thinning when we put 3/4 of the spray in the top of the tree and only 1/4 in the bottom. And then if we have to spray at 18 millimeters, we completely shut off the bottom nozzles and only spray the top. Otherwise, we over thin the bottoms. Lastly, let me make a comment about Regulate. There are some of you who traditionally like to put Regulate with your thinning spray, and it does increase the response of NA. It gives you more potent thinning. Also, we're probably likely going to need to put streptomycin in this Petal Fall spray if you listen to Carrick's presentation earlier. And Regulate does help with the response of strep, an uptake of strep into the blossoms. But if we have a deficit, that Regulate makes NA so potent that often we get more thinning than we want. So I'd like to propose two kind of general rules. If you have carbohydrate deficits, don't include Regulate, even though you're spraying strep. Just spray the strep without Regulate and don't put it in because it will cause too much thinning from the NA. But on years, or for example, if the lake sites in next Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday show no deficit, and it looks like we've got a surplus, then you could put Regulate in as a way to help boost the amount of thinning you're going to get under relatively cool conditions. I want to conclude with just a plea that after you make these Petal Fall sprays, whether it's the next 3 days or you start on Sunday if you're a lake site, how do you know how well it went, how much thinning you got? And the only really good way that we know of to tell is to measure fruitlet diameters and use the fruit growth rate model. About 50 degree days after your Petal Fall application, go out and measure fruitlets, and then measure them a second time at 100 degree days after that application, and then use the fruit growth rate model, and you can determine how much thinning you're going to get. Our suggested protocol is to count and select 5 representative trees in each block. You count all the flower clusters on that tree to start with, but we don't count bloom on 1-year wood. Then we tag only 15 spurs from top to bottom of the tree. And when we get 50 degree days after the application, measure their diameter. Then remeasure when you get to 100 degree days after application, enter the data in the Malusim app, and it will immediately tell you how many fruits are falling off and how many are staying. I put up this slide just to help you see and visualize. This was data from last year when a person sprayed on May 26th, when 200 degree days had accumulated since bloom. It would be easy then for that person to determine when to make the first measurement by looking forward to when you get to about 250 degree days, 50 degree days after that spray, which would be about May 31st. Now that was a period of cool temperatures. So it took about 5 days for the first measurement. This year with warm temperatures, it might only take 3 days. But if you time when to measure based on degree days, you get a better answer. Now I end with this slide, this a screenshot of what you see when you use the malusim.org fruit growth rate model. And you enter the data either on your phone or you can type it in on a computer at the malusim.org website and then run the model. It will show you what was the average fruit size on the day, first time and second time you measured. But more importantly, it will show you how many fruits are expected to persist and go to harvest. Now, this was data from last year, Jill McKenzie's block that I borrowed. And it showed that in her case and Mark Russell's case, they had 635 potential fruits on the tree, or about 130 clusters with 5 fruits per cluster. With those 1 sprays at Petal Fall, I can't remember if they blossomed thin in addition, but certainly the Petal Fall spray took it all the way down from 600 fruits down to 140 fruits. Their target was 85 fruits, so they got very close to their final target with just a Petal Fall spray. Why did that happen? Because it was warm last year at Petal Fall. And this year we have another opportunity with warm weather, at least in the next few days, to get a substantial amount of our thinning done. But by measuring fruits, they were able to see that they were pretty close to their target, and then they didn't have to thin anymore and just adjusted a little bit by hand thinning. If they hadn't done this, they might have thinned another time and then overshot the mark and overthinned. So with that plea to measure fruitlets, and I'll help you if you send me the data, I'll conclude my presentation now and be happy to talk more or have some discussion or questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Terence. Looks like you have one in the chat box. Does the degree day based Petal Fall thinning window target 5 to 8 millimeter fruit diameter?
It targets 5 to 6 millimeter.
That's what I thought.
So 8 millimeters is a little bit beyond the 130. But that's my point also, that if you spray at 140 or 150 degree days, you can still get thinning, but you're now really targeting 8 millimeter fruit.